It was a chilly Tuesday afternoon when Mabel Ross stepped through the front doors of the Ellis Ford Museum of Fine Arts. The automatic glass parted with a quiet sigh, but the air inside held a kind of stillness that only old paintings and older prejudices could maintain. She had taken the bus across town, 2 transfers, 3 blocks of walking, just to be here. Her coat was heavy wool, hand-mended at the cuffs. Her shoes were brown leather, the kind that lasted decades if you knew how to oil them. Her hair was pinned back in a neat bun. No jewelry, no makeup. A canvas tote hung from her shoulder, filled with a tangerine, a bottle of water, and a folded sweater. Nothing about her stood out, except, apparently, her presence. As she stepped into the grand foyer, her eyes lifted instinctively to the tall arched ceiling, where light poured through stained glass like melted gold. She paused, not to gawk, but to breathe. She had waited years to visit this place, heard about it on public radio, seen it once in a brochure her neighbor mailed. She was here to see the newly installed exhibit, Women and the Brushstroke of Power, a rare and celebrated curation of works by female artists from the 18th to 20th centuries. But before she could take another step, a voice interrupted her gaze. "Excuse me, ma'am?" She turned. A young woman in a slim black dress and laminated badge approached. Her expression was polite, but not warm. Her eyes scanned Mabel's coat, her shoes, the gray wisps of hair escaping her bun. "Do you need help finding the exit?" the woman asked, smiling as if the question were a kindness. Mabel blinked. "No," she said softly. "I'm here to see the exhibit." The young woman's smile didn't change, but her tone tightened just enough to reveal the tension beneath the surface. "I see. It's just, we've had some confusion recently with people entering from the cafe side without a ticket. Would you mind showing me yours?" Mabel nodded and reached slowly into her coat pocket. She handed the crumpled slip to the woman, who glanced at it, then back at Mabel. "All right," she said after a pause. "Just so you know, the exhibit is quite academic. It's not really guided like a tour. You might find it a bit overwhelming." "I'll manage," Mabel replied, her voice neither offended nor apologetic. She moved to walk past, but the woman stepped slightly into her path again. "I'm sorry, she glanced around, as if checking for backup. "Do you have anyone with you today? A daughter, maybe? Or a group?" "No, just me." Another pause. A longer one. "Ma'am," the woman said, lowering her voice. "Are you sure you're in the right place? The public gardens are just around the corner. They're beautiful this time of year, and they don't require as much background to appreciate." Mabel looked at her, not with anger, but with something firmer, something ancient. "I know exactly where I am," she said, "and I didn't come for flowers." Before the young woman could answer, another employee arrived, older, more confident. He took one look at the situation and stepped in. "Everything all right here, Jenna?" Jenna straightened. This woman was she hesitated. There was a concern about access. Mabel turned to the man and offered her ticket again. He took it, scanned it, and handed it back. "She's good," he said. "Let her through." Jenna gave a tight smile, nodded, and stepped aside. But as Mabel walked past, she heard the younger woman mutter under her breath. "She doesn't even look educated." The words landed like a pebble dropped in still water. Small but loud. Mabel didn't stop walking. She didn't look back. But inside, something coiled and uncoiled all at once. Not because she hadn't heard worse in her life, but because it never stopped surprising her how easily people confused packaging for substance. She had once raised 4 children on a school librarian's salary. She had once read the Odyssey out loud, every year, to a classroom of 12-year-olds who thought Homer was a cartoon character. She had once written essays by candlelight, edited grant proposals for a nonprofit she never named, and sat with war veterans as they described, in trembling detail, the art they saw in nightmares. But no, she didn't look the part. She made her way down the marble corridor, each step echoing like a defiance. When she reached the exhibit entrance, she paused, not because she was lost, but because in that moment, something in her decided, let them watch. Let them whisper. She would walk through every gallery. She would take her time. She would stand in front of every canvas until her bones understood the brushstroke. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that in exactly 17 minutes, someone else would walk through those same museum doors. A woman in heels, a navy dress, a name badge with the word Curator written in gold. And that woman would say, "Where is my mother?" 17 minutes later, the heavy front doors of the Ellis Ford Museum opened again, but this time the atmosphere shifted. Not because of noise or chaos, but because of presence. Clara Ross walked in with the quiet authority of someone who had earned her place not through noise, but through years of study, dedication, and integrity. Her heels echoed once across the marble floor, then softened into steady rhythm as she crossed the foyer. She wore navy blue, not flashy, not sharp, but clean. Her ID badge glinted under the soft lighting, catching the attention of every staff member nearby. It read, Clara Ross, Senior Curator, Ellis Ford Museum of Fine Arts. Jenna, the young woman who had spoken to Mabel earlier, was standing near the main desk, flipping through a brochure she wasn't reading. She looked up and immediately stiffened when she saw Clara. They hadn't spoken often. Clara worked mostly behind the scenes, in archives, restoration chambers, meetings with international lenders. But everyone at the museum knew who she was. The curator. The youngest woman to ever lead a full exhibit at Ellis Ford. The one with the PhD from Yale and the humility to credit her public high school librarian whenever she gave a talk. Clara didn't smile. She wasn't in the mood for pleasantries. She walked straight to Jenna, calm but unmistakably direct. "Where is my mother?" she asked. Jenna blinked. I'm sorry. My mother," Clara repeated more slowly. "She arrived 20 minutes ago. Gray hair, wool coat, brown shoes. You couldn't have missed her." The silence that followed was brief but heavy. Jenna swallowed. She's here," she stammered. "I mean, she went through already. I didn't know. What did you say to her?" Clara's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Jenna looked down. "I thought she was confused. She didn't look like most of our guests. I asked if she needed help. Help finding the exhibit, or help finding the exit?" Clara asked. Now the pause was longer. Clara didn't wait for an answer. "Don't worry," she said coldly. "You've already answered." She turned and walked away, heels clicking again, but this time faster, more pointed. She passed through the corridor toward the exhibit hall, scanning each gallery for a glimpse of the woman she had come to honor that very day. Because what Jenna and the rest didn't know, what even some of her own staff hadn't connected, was that the exhibit Women and the Brushstroke of Power had been inspired by her mother. Not just in theme or tone, but in name, in purpose. The very idea of it had been born in Clara's mind years ago as she sat at the kitchen table watching Mabel, then 70 years old, cut out newspaper articles of overlooked female painters and taped them into notebooks like sacred archives. Mabel had done it not for a class, not for publication, but because she believed someone should remember them. And when Clara received her first grant, it was Mabel who suggested, quietly, maybe show them what art looks like when it doesn't beg for attention. Clara finally spotted her in Gallery 3, standing still before a canvas painted in muted reds and ochres, her eyes tracing the brushwork with the kind of patience museums were built to deserve. She didn't notice her daughter at first. She was too busy reading the artist's statement, lips moving ever so slightly as if tasting the words. Clara stepped beside her and whispered, "Beautiful, isn't it?" Mabel looked, blinked once in recognition, then smiled. "You made it." "Of course I did," Clara said. "I told you I'd come before closing." "It's good." Mabel nodded toward the painting. She knew color like it was language. Clara's chest tightened. "She did. And you knew that before anyone else." Mabel didn't respond immediately. Then, softly, "They tried to send me to the garden." Clara closed her eyes for half a second. "I know," said. "I didn't look the part." "You look exactly like the reason this place exists," Clara replied. "And I intend to make that very clear." For the next half hour, mother and daughter moved silently through the galleries. Occasionally, Mabel would pause to read, or lean slightly forward to see a brushstroke, and Clara would remain beside her, not as a curator, not as a scholar, but as a student of the woman who had taught her how to see. The guests walking past began to take notice. A few recognized Clara. Some murmured her name. But it was the older woman beside her who drew longer looks now, not because of her coat, but because of how the curator stood beside her. Like she belonged. Like she mattered. Because she did. Eventually, Clara led Mabel to the small, intimate rotunda at the end of the exhibit. There, a bronze plaque was mounted beside a final portrait, a delicate painting of hands, aged, gentle, resting atop an open book. Below the painting, etched in quiet elegance, were the words, For Mabel Ross, who taught me that every masterpiece begins with a woman who dared to be unseen. Mabel stared at it for a long time. Then she exhaled, the sound quiet but full. Clara waited. She didn't need thanks. She had already received everything she ever needed in 1,000 untitled gestures across a lifetime. But Mabel finally turned and said, "You made them remember." And Clara replied, "Only because you taught me how." After the plaque, neither of them spoke for a while. There was nothing left to explain. The words were etched in bronze, but the real tribute lived in something softer. In how Clara stood a little straighter beside her mother, and how Mabel's eyes didn't fill with tears, but with the kind of still pride that comes only after a life spent giving without expecting applause. They moved through the last chamber of the exhibit slowly, not because of fatigue, but because they knew the moment was too sacred to rush. The final piece was a self-portrait by a Mexican artist, done in oil and shadow. Mabel looked at it for a long time before saying, almost to herself, she painted herself like she was being watched by someone who loved her. Clara nodded. "That's how I've always seen you." They left the exhibit hand in hand, just as they used to walk down the neighborhood library steps all those years ago. Back then, Clara was a small girl with scuffed shoes and questions too big for her pockets. Her mother never answered everything. She just placed another book in her hands and said, "Let it ask you something new." That afternoon, they sat in the museum cafe, tucked into a corner table by the window, a pot of tea between them. No sugar, just lemon slices floating like petals on the surface. Mabel stirred hers slowly, though she didn't drink. "You've done well, Clara," she said at last. "You've done something real." Clara didn't respond right away. She was watching her mother's hands, aged, weathered, the knuckles soft but strong from years of holding everything a life could carry. "Do you remember," Clara asked, "when I brought home that crayon drawing and told you I wanted to be an artist?" Mabel smiled faintly. "You cried when your teacher didn't pin it up. And you took me to the art supply store the next day," Clara continued, "with the $20 you'd been saving for your winter coat." Mabel shrugged, as if it had been nothing. "Coats come and go. That fire in your hands. That needed feeding." Clara leaned forward, voice lower now. "I think about that all the time. When I'm in the boardroom. When I'm curating. When someone talks down to me with a smirk that says, 'You're just a girl from East Riverton.' I remember you sitting on the floor of the living room, cataloging your little art clippings, talking to no one but the air, like the world should have cared even if it never did." Mabel stirred again. It wasn't about them caring. It was about not letting beauty be forgotten, even if it was just in a scrapbook no one ever opened. Clara paused, her eyes moist but steady. "You raised me to believe that knowledge didn't need permission. That learning was sacred. That silence could be powerful. But I hate that people like Jenna can still look at someone like you and assume less." Mabel looked up now, her gaze clear and calm. "That's not your fight alone, Clara. It's the world's. We teach it by how we respond." I didn't correct her today because it's not always my job to fix people's vision. It's theirs. "But doesn't it still hurt?" Clara asked. Mabel exhaled slowly. "Only if I forget who I am. And I've lived too long to do that." Outside the window, students from a nearby university group were lining up for a tour. Backpacks slung low, phones in hand, eyes half-focused. Mabel watched them, then turned back to her daughter. "They'll walk past paintings today that were made by women who never saw them hang, whose names were erased, whose canvases were signed by men just so they could be sold. But someone, somewhere, remembered. Someone said, 'This matters.' That's what you've done here. You've made remembering an act of justice." Clara was silent. The words fell on her like a benediction. Not heavy, but sacred, earned. They finished their tea. No fanfare, no press. Just two women rising slowly from a corner table, leaving behind a receipt and a ripple of something greater than ceremony. As they walked out, Jenna stood by the reception desk again. This time, she looked up. Her face was pale, and her eyes held the weight of realization. She started to speak, but Mabel raised a hand gently. "Let it go," she said. "Today, we all learned something." Clara didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Her presence alone made it clear that judgment had met its match, not in aggression, but in grace. They exited the museum as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the stone steps. Clara offered her arm, and Mabel took it, not out of need, but out of shared habit. They walked slowly, their pace matching. Two lives intertwined, one built on the shoulders of the other. "Where to next?" Clara asked. "The bookstore," Mabel said. "They're holding a copy of that new art history release. I want to see if it gets the details right." Clara smiled. "Still checking the footnotes?" "Always," Mabel said. "Truth lives in the small print." The bookstore was only 3 blocks away, tucked between a bakery and an old shoe repair shop that still smelled faintly of leather and glue. The bell above the door chimed as Mabel stepped inside, its sound triggering memories she didn't expect to find again so late in life. There had always been something sacred about bookstores for her, a kind of soft reverence in the way the shelves leaned toward one another, as if in whispered conversation. Clara stayed by her side, but said nothing. She knew her mother's rhythm: quiet first, then curiosity, then the slow unfolding of thought like pages in a well-worn diary. Mabel walked slowly, her fingers brushing the spines of the art history section, eyes alert in a way they hadn't been even at the exhibit. She wasn't scanning titles. She was feeling for truth. "I used to do this with you," Clara said finally. "Every Saturday. Remember?" Mabel nodded, her eyes still on the shelf. "You always drifted toward mythology. I had to drag you away from dragons and make you look at Degas." "You never forced it," Clara replied. "You just told me stories about women who weren't in the textbooks. You made them feel real, like they had kitchens and bad days and laughed when no one was watching." Mabel pulled a hardcover from the shelf and opened it carefully. The page fell to a painting she knew well, a portrait by Artemisia Gentileschi. A woman in shadow, holding a dagger with one hand and a book with the other. Her lips unreadable, her eyes aware. "They erased her for centuries," Mabel said softly, painted over her with polite silence. "But look, she never dropped the blade." Clara watched her mother in that moment and saw her for everything she had always been but rarely named. A woman with sharp edges wrapped in warmth, a protector of forgotten truths, a scholar without credentials, a lighthouse no storm had ever dared extinguish. She thought back to her own childhood, how their home had always smelled faintly of paper and cinnamon. Mabel couldn't afford new furniture, but she filled their lives with secondhand books and stories that cost nothing but attention. When money was tight, birthdays meant poetry read aloud at breakfast. When Clara came home bullied or tired or heartbroken, Mabel never offered easy answers. Just tea, and a reminder that pain, too, was a kind of passage, one that made art possible. As Mabel made her purchase and they stepped back onto the sidewalk, Clara asked quietly, "Did you ever wish you'd done something else? Gone further in school? Made your own name?" Mabel smiled, but it wasn't a smile of regret. "I never had the time," she said. "And later, I realized, I didn't need the world to remember me. I just needed to make sure you remembered the world." They passed the bakery, where the scent of fresh bread wafted out onto the street like a memory calling them home. The sun was beginning to dip low, throwing long shadows that stretched like secrets. Mabel's steps slowed, not from fatigue, but reflection. "You know," she began, "when I was young, they told me I was clever for a girl. They said it like it was a compliment, like cleverness was a coat I could wear for a season before I outgrew it and married someone who could read contracts better than I could. But I kept reading anyway. After the kids went to sleep, before your father got home, on the bus, in the laundry room, knowledge became a kind of defiance. It kept me whole, even when the world kept trying to cut me into smaller, more acceptable pieces." Clara listened, absorbing every word like a student before a great teacher. "You always seemed so calm," she said, "like the world couldn't touch you." Mabel chuckled. "Oh, it touched me, bruised me sometimes. But I learned early on. They can question your credentials, your clothing, your accent, your age. But they can't take what's already rooted inside you. Unless you let them." She paused. "I never let them." They walked in silence again for a block, the distance between them filled with a kind of reverence that only grows between people who have spent a lifetime earning one another's trust. When they reached the bus stop, Mabel sat carefully on the wooden bench, placing her bag in her lap. Clara stood beside her, unwilling to say goodbye just yet. "You know," Mabel said, "I used to think museums weren't for people like me. They were for people who had the luxury to appreciate beauty without worrying about rent or dinner or hand-me-down shoes. But then I realized, the museum is just a building. The art was made by people who bled and wept and scraped by. It's not that I didn't belong in the museum. It's that the museum forgot it was built for people like me." Clara sat beside her then, tears brimming but not falling. "That's why I put your name on the wall," she whispered. "Not just for you. For every woman who stood where you did today and was asked to leave. For every mother who taught in kitchens and on buses and at bedtime. You built this, even if they didn't know it." Mabel placed a hand over hers. "Now they do." The bus rumbled into view. Mabel stood, kissed Clara's cheek, and stepped aboard. As she took her seat by the window, she looked back once, her eyes steady. Clara lifted a hand in farewell. Then the bus pulled away, leaving behind the image of a woman in a wool coat, holding a book in her lap, and a lifetime of quiet rebellion in her spine. 1 week later, the museum announced a new community initiative called the Unseen Archives. It wasn't a press-heavy launch, nor was it tied to donors or politicians. It began with a single wooden table in a side gallery, quiet, unadorned, and placed beneath a handwritten sign that simply read, "Tell us who they were." There were no requirements. No degree necessary. No name tag needed. Just a small stack of notebooks, a few pens, and a short introduction, penned by Clara herself, that explained. For every woman whose story was never painted, never signed, never remembered, we're listening now. Mabel was the first to write. She returned quietly one morning, arriving just after opening, her coat buttoned high against the cold, a knit scarf wrapped around her neck. She didn't tell Clara she was coming. She didn't ask for permission. She just sat at the table, opened the first page of a blank notebook, and began to write, not about herself, but about Mrs. Ellison, her high school English teacher, who once stayed after class 3 nights a week to help girls learn to read while the boys practiced baseball. She wrote about Aunt Geneva, who could draw anything but never sold a single piece because raising 7 children on her own left no time for galleries. She wrote about her neighbor Dolores, who taught herself to play the piano from discarded sheet music she rescued from the church dumpster. And then, on the final line of the final page, she wrote only, "We did not forget beauty. We just carried it quietly." Within 2 weeks, the notebooks began to fill. One woman wrote about her grandmother's quilts, which had stories sewn into the stitches that only she could interpret. A man left a note about his mother's hands, rough from work but gentle enough to sculpt clay birds that still sat on his mantel. A teenager from a local school shared how his lunch lady used to draw tiny flowers on every brown paper bag. Page after page, the museum became less a place of silence and more a sanctuary of recognition. The visitors changed too. There were still tourists with cameras and parents corralling loud children, but there were also people who came to sit, to read, to write, to remember. Clara added a shelf beside the table to hold the finished volumes. She labeled each by date, and inside the cover, she left one note. "These stories are as valuable as anything on our walls." The staff began reading them during breaks. The security guard who once only nodded at guests now asked them if they had someone they'd like to remember. Jenna, the young woman who had dismissed Mabel that first day, began volunteering at weekend workshops for seniors who wanted to learn how to tell their life stories through visual art. No one told her to. No one asked her to apologize. She simply changed. And perhaps that was enough. As the weeks turned into months, a new plaque appeared beneath the portrait of Mabel's hands. It was not bronze this time. It was wood, carved simply, in Mabel's own handwriting, copied from her final notebook page. It read, "The ones you forget are the ones who raised you." And beneath it, in Clara's smaller hand, every masterpiece was once a woman who went unnoticed. One spring morning, a class of college students arrived for a scheduled tour. Their professor led them through the modernist wing, past the sculpture atrium, and finally into the women's exhibit. Clara met them there. She didn't talk about brush techniques or artistic movements. Instead, she stood beside the community table, rested her hand on the full notebooks, and asked the students one question. "Whose name do you remember, but have never spoken aloud in a place like this?" A silence followed, longer than expected. Then one girl stepped forward. "My aunt," she said softly. "She taught me how to paint when I was 7. She died last year. No one ever talks about her because she never made it. But she mattered. She mattered to me." Clara nodded. "Then write her name." And the girl did. That was the day the museum changed forever. Not because of budgets or donors or headlines, but because it had finally started doing what Mabel always knew museums were meant to do. Not just display the grand, but dignify the hidden. And as for Mabel herself, she never once asked how many people read her name. She never counted the notebooks, never checked the guest book, never tallied the ripple of what she had inspired. She returned to her life of books, her violets in the kitchen window, her letters written in longhand. But every so often, Clara would receive a postcard. No return address, just a painting of a woman, and a note that read, "She remembered beauty. So do I." And so, when Mabel passed quietly in her sleep the following winter, there was no grand ceremony. No marble. No eulogy in stained glass halls. Just a wooden bench placed in the east wing of the museum, beside the table of notebooks. A small brass plate was affixed to it, inscribed with 7 words that held 1,000 lifetimes. She sat. She listened. She made room. That was Mabel's legacy. Not just in Clara, not just in the exhibit, but in every quiet woman who had been told she didn't belong, who then proved, simply by existing, that she did. And for those who visited the museum in the years to come and asked, who was Mabel Ross? The answer was never given in a brochure or a plaque. It was given in the hush that fell as people picked up the pen, turned the page, and remembered someone worth writing down.